Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today, a check-in on three stories we're following closely here on the stream. California is burning. Wildfires continue to burn the southern part of the state, and the death toll is rising. And the passing of a real-life superhero. We'll take a look at the legacy of comic book writer Stan Lee.
I'm Malika Bilal. I'll be looking for your comments on Twitter and, of course, in our YouTube chat. First, though, to a story that we've been covering closely on Al Jazeera, political crisis in Sri Lanka.
Yesterday in Parliament, 122 MPs, verbally and by means of a motion, expressed no confidence in former President Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister. As per Article 42 of our Constitution, that renders the Cabinet of Ministers now dissolved. President Maithripala Sirisena must follow parliamentary procedure and remove former President Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister and appoint someone who enjoys the confidence of the House in his place.
There was chaos in Parliament on Thursday as lawmakers came to blows one day after legislators voted the Prime Minister out of office. It has been several weeks of upheaval. On October the 26th, President Maithripala Sirisena fired Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and replaced him with Mahinda Rajapaksa, a controversial former president. Mr. Sirisena also dissolved the parliament and called for snap elections in January. Both men are now claiming the post of Prime Minister. On Tuesday, in a dramatic intervention, the Supreme Court overturned the president's decision and ordered a halt to election preparations.
Well, to help us unpack all of that from Delhi, India, is Emily Schmall. She's a South Asia correspondent for the Associated Press, and she recently returned from Colombo. Welcome to the stream, Emily. I want to start with some dramatic scenes on my laptop via tweets. These are some pictures. They appear to be screen grabs of people looking on TV and seeing these scenes here. Roll tweets this: scary scenes in Parliament, things being thrown at the Speaker. Here's another one, also from Ro, a journalist. She tweets, MPs break out in fisticuffs in Parliament. So a member of our community writes, this is unfortunate, and what we witnessed in Parliament today is frankly embarrassing. Government has come to a standstill, seemingly because of the president's unwillingness to work with the current composition of Parliament. So Emily, keeping in mind those photos, what happened in Parliament on Thursday?
Well, essentially, we've got to start with Wednesday, when Parliament was reconvened for the first time since this crisis was sparked on October 26th. So it's been about 3 weeks. And they met yesterday, and immediately a no confidence motion was brought to the floor, and it passed, and essentially meaning that that the majority of parliamentarians in Sri Lanka do not have confidence in Mahinda Rajapaksa, the former strongman president, who very sort of unexpectedly replaced the sitting prime minister in Sri Lanka a few weeks ago. And so as these images show, today, Mr. Rajapaksa came in and said that he did not recognize the outcome of that vote, that it hadn't been done properly. And you see both sides sort of scrambling for control of the mic and trying to get to the Speaker of Parliament, who has become sort of an important figure in all of this drama in the last few weeks.
I'm so glad you used the word drama, Emily, because just trying to keep up with who's who and the major motivations behind them feels like a major soap opera with different characters returning, going out, losing their parts, getting recast. Can you help us understand who are the main players, just very briefly, and what do you think is motivating their actions right now?
Right, yeah, so President Maithripala Sirisena, obviously president, he's been in office for just a few years, and he was formerly in the cabinet of former President Rajapaksa. And those two sort of had a falling out. Sirisena decided to compete against him in the 2015 election. And Rajapaksa is a very popular figure in Sri Lanka. He oversaw the end of a decades-long conflict with the Tamil Tiger rebel group. So it wasn't clear at all that Sirisena would win. And in fact, he really was only able to prevail by forming a coalition with a very unlikely partner, who is the third sort of main character in this drama, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's the ousted prime minister. And the two of them are very ideologically different and have been sort of at one another's throats for a long time. So while the ouster itself was unexpected, this was coming to a boil for a while.
I want to share with our audience just two tidbits of public opinion. So unscientific poll here, but these are people on Twitter who wrote to us about this issue. One is Black Mamba, who writes, as a Sri Lankan, I am saddened to say this, but we need intervention from more enlightened world powers to light up our dark nation. There must be an intervention. A madman is in charge of our military and police. Another person writes in, this is Muhammad on Twitter, who says, the quicker Sri Lankans understand the importance of separation of powers, the better. We are on the brink of a dictatorship. So some strong sentiments there, Emily. But what are people that you're talking to? How are they feeling about this chaos and this stalemate?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think the Supreme Court weighed in on this here this week and effectively put a stay on the Sirisena decrees, saying, we're not sure that it's constitutional for you to just simply replace your prime minister the way that he did, or to dissolve the parliament, which was why parliament was able to reconvene this week. But I think a lot of civil society people, academics, and sort of constitutional scholars in Sri Lanka were really gladdened by that development because they see it as democracy working in Sri Lanka. So though the country's only been out of a civil conflict for about a decade, I think people believe that institutions can work and must work and will work somehow. But as for how this is all resolved, I think that's really an open question.
I think that is what our community thinks as well. Thiagi here, I'll end with her tweet, who says a mature legislature must be able to find a resolution to this impasse, or a supermajority of parliament will have to decide to dissolve parliament, according to the Constitution. So, Emily, we will have to leave it there for now. But of course, this story is far from over, and we look forward to having you back on. Now, from here to fires in the western state of California that continue to burn. The death toll is now over 50 and expected to rise. This is Tony Albertson, who had to flee her home.
I was woken up by the fire department outside of our home. It was 3 a.m. and I had gotten a couple of notices on my phone, and within literally maybe 3 minutes we were out the door with our cat in hand in our car in a traffic jam, flames behind the hills, flames in front of us. It was terrifying. I was afraid we might not get out, and we just got onto the freeway and headed to the closest evacuation center about 15 miles away.
Well, at this time, there are about 2 large active fires burning in California, the Woolsey Fire and Camp Fire. There are a few others that are mostly contained. Hundreds of thousands of acres and thousands of homes have burned to the ground. And as firefighters battle the blazes, the search for several hundred missing people has begun.
So joining us from San Francisco, we have Lily Jamali. She is co-host and correspondent for KQED's The California Report, a statewide daily news program, and Scott McLean, Public Information Officer for California Fire. Thank you both for joining us. Lily, I'm going to jump straight onto your Twitter feed here because you give us real-life examples of what it is like to be living in these areas that are at risk from being burnt. Residents at the Sunshine Assisted Living Retirement Community in Paradise were in the middle of breakfast when the call to evacuate came. If you've never been in this situation, it must be hard to imagine what happens. What is that call? What do you have to do? Lily, what do you know about that?
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to report that all of the people in that facility, to my knowledge, were safely transported to a facility in a city a little bit north of Butte County in Redding. So happy to be able to report that. But that picture really gives you a sense of the immediacy of this evacuation, how quickly things came together. And one of the lines of reporting that we're working on right now is what happened with the notification system here, because time and again, when I ask residents of Paradise if they ever got a notification from law enforcement, none of them have to this point. And so I think we're going to be learning more about that process and what happened. I asked the sheriff of Butte County this very question, and he said that, people may fail to appreciate just how quickly this fire broke out and how fast it moved. So what you have right now is, those longer term questions will be answered.
Sure.
In the immediate term, people are looking for their loved ones and their
Let's bring Scott in here, because Scott, you're nodding. I'm trying to imagine what it must be like for me to be told you need to get out. How does that happen, Scott?
You have to understand this fire started about 6:30, a little bit before, and just garnered that momentum and just kept coming. It was throwing spot fires out ahead of it, which drew the main body of that fire in, and it exponentially gained speed. And when it hit Paradise, it wasn't just a narrow flame front. It was the whole southern border of Paradise due to spot fires coming over a river into the town of Paradise. It's something similar to an area ignition. So many acres caught on fire at almost one time on the south side of Paradise. Paradise is a retirement community, a wooded community up in the foothills with narrow wood roadways to get those folks out. So by the time I made it up there, an hour or so after it started on the Polga side, I was coming up on the south side of Paradise, and it was just, for a better term, it was hell.
So I wanted to add or to give some clarity for our online audience, because we got a tweet like this that reminds me that not everyone is aware of the origins of this. Keela here says, I'd just like to know, California is the 10th largest economy in the world. I think I speak for a lot of people in asking why these fires aren't planned for in advance. Maybe I don't understand, but it's not like these are monsoon rains. Please ask one of your guests. So Scott, I'm going to give that to you. Do we know how this fire started, and the idea that this could be planned for, that this is part of wildfire season, if you could call it that?
Well,
what do you make of that?
It's not a season anymore. It's wildfires year-round. Our vegetation is extremely dry as it's ever been. It's just thinking of a bunch of matchsticks that are very receptive to fire. We had a drought started in 2012, a very significant drought that basically hasn't stopped, no matter what moisture we have. It's going to take California several years of winter to bring up to that plateau. 129 million dead trees. But going back to the fact to be prepared for, Paradise is one of those towns that knew something like this was going to come. They prepared for it through fuel reduction projects, through prescribed burns, to put those borders and boundaries around their town. They practiced escapes. I believe it was earlier this year or sometime maybe last year, they did a practice emergency in the town of Paradise. They know how to get everybody out. But the fact that this fire, it didn't care. It just lit the whole town on fire, to put a visual out there at once. Everybody tried to leave at once. Before, your towns develop these programs of evacuation that are kind of like, some cases, zones. So you kind of build up to that. But this whole town had to be evacuated.
And if I could just add, Scott, that is such an important point, and a piece of reporting that I just came across recently, this notion that Paradise was ready for this. They had prepared. How many towns do you know that have an evacuation plan? It's because they came very close to seeing their town burn down almost 10 years ago, and my colleagues at KQED have been reporting on this extensively. But one of the things I want to add is, having reported on fires in that exact region 15 years ago, it's a really different ballgame now. We've talked a bit about this, how fire season is no longer fire season. It's a year-long phenomenon. It used to pretty much be over by October, and you're up against drought conditions left over from the 2012 to 2017 period. It's really become, it's odd, to be cold during fire season when you come home after reporting on a day out there, and it really speaks to how the conditions have changed. Climate change presumably has played a role here and changed the dynamic in a way we're just starting to understand. And so it's been interesting also seeing Jerry Brown on one side talking about climate change. You're not hearing federal officials talk about that at all. And so it worries me, when you can't agree on a cause, how do you come up with a solution?
And then, of course, Jerry Brown being the governor of California. I wanted to share with you a comment from Jeff. Jeff is the deputy director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And here's what he told the stream.
When we look at the fires out west, I think the first thing that comes forward is, of course, the heroism of those fighting the fires and putting their lives on the line to help others, as well as the tragedy of so many communities disrupted and in some cases completely destroyed. And it's important to remember that, we're not looking at a week or 2 weeks or even a year before these communities recover. It's going to be decades. It's going to be 10 years or more, and that's under the best of circumstances.
So, Scott, how does that journey to recovery even begin?
Well, keep in mind, I only live 20 miles away down in Chico in the valley. My parents used to live in Paradise. He's nailed it. I feel it's going to take at least 20 years. You have to rebuild your whole infrastructure. Your town is gone. There's very few structures left standing. Commercial, apartments, homes, everything. There is no town structure. So I know folks are already banding together. They're coming up with plans, and they're going to rebuild. They will back and be up and running. I'd say probably it's going to take 20 years.
I want to share this from YouTube. Kiko says, my condolences to the United States citizens suffering from the fires in California. Thank you to all of the firefighters. That's live on YouTube. And a big thank you to Lily and to Scott for joining us for this segment. Our thoughts at the stream are also with those who've been affected.
And now the passing of a real-life superhero. Stan Lee died on Monday, leaving a large legacy, the entire Marvel universe.
I think Stan Lee's greatest legacy is his commitment to fandom. People may argue about his relationship with Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby, but all three of these men, everyone has to agree, left us a legacy of characters that we've all grown up on. And no one will argue that Stan was not all about the fans. He was at every convention. He was always reaching out to fans wherever he went. And I think the thing that I'm going to miss the most is going to look for where he'd make a cameo appearance in a Marvel movie. He will definitely be missed.
With us now to discuss the life and legacy of Stan Lee, we have Brian Cronin, a writer at Comic Book Resources. You were watching that video and smiling. Brian, why were you smiling?
I think it's a very good description of Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. He really was all about the fans.
When you are thinking about his life and what he contributed to the worlds of comics and the world of superheroes, what would you say was his greatest legacy, his greatest gift?
Him personally, I guess I would say, right when he started with Jack Kirby and all the other artists at Marvel in the early 60s, one of the biggest things that they did was to try to make superheroes with feet of clay. These were people that we could relate to, that were not cut apart and different, like, say, Superman. As a great hero, he is not... Basically, when Stan Lee created Fantastic Four with Jack Kirby, these were heroes that bickered. These were heroes like us.
I'm so glad you said that, because we actually got this comment from YouTube. So many people actually writing us on YouTube about this segment of our show. Old Trafford King says, Stan Lee will be remembered for making superheroes that were flawed and closer to reality, but he encouraged people to be inclusive in his storytelling. So Brian, going a little bit geeky right here, but if you know the Marvel universe, you know that so many of the characters are normal people with a twist, with something that makes them unique. They're not really superheroes from another planet, like they might be in another superhero realm, i.e. DC Comics. Talk to us about that, superheroes that are flawed.
Certainly. Spider-Man is probably the greatest example of that, where here was a teen superhero at a time when the only teen superheroes were sidekicks. Here was a teen who was the hero of the book, and not only that, his very origin is that he lets a criminal get away. The criminal then goes and kills his beloved uncle, and he realizes that with great power must also come great responsibility.
Stan Lee was really a genius at promoting not just his characters, but also himself, to the point where you would think nobody else was involved in creating the Marvel Universe. Is that perhaps one of the more critical parts of his legacy, where people forget or he eclipses everybody else that he worked with? Was that deliberate, do you think, Brian?
I don't believe it was deliberate, but at the same time, he also didn't exactly go out of his way to avoid it either. I mean, think about it. For the last 40 years or so, Marvel Comics had Stan Lee Presents at the front of every issue. And he certainly did not go away from that. If people wanted to give him the credit and ignore the others, he was willing to go along with that.
I want to play you a comment from a former stream guest that we got. Her name was Sonya Valentine, and she was on a show that we did about indigenous superheroes and indigenous comics. She's a Cree writer and filmmaker, and here's what she told the stream.
Hey, my name is Sonya. I'm a Cree filmmaker and writer from Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I was influenced by Stan Lee through the 1960s animated Spider-Man TV show and through the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films with Tobey Maguire. I always loved that line from the first Spider-Man that resonates to the rest of the series. With great power comes great responsibility. I always thought that was such a beautiful line. And I hope wherever Stan Lee is, he knows how much he meant to a lot of people.
So she gave us her favorite line, her favorite character. Mine, of course, is Black Panther, and all of the characters in Black Panther. What is yours? Who's your favorite character?
I think Spider-Man probably is the one. I wrote an article recently where back in 1965, Esquire interviewed college students and asked, who are your heroes? And the typical Bob Dylan, everything, all the generational talent of the 60s were certainly common answers. But so was Spider-Man. With one respondent said, Spider-Man is so great because he's beset by woes, money problems, and the question of existence. In short, he is one of us. And you don't get much better than that.
What I noticed when Stan Lee was trending on social media on Monday, and millions of people were talking about him, was his thoughts about social justice that he was talking about perhaps before many other people were talking about, and in the realm of comic books and superheroes. Share some of those thoughts with us.
Certainly. Stan Lee was very cognizant of the effect that superheroes should have on the idea of social justice. One interesting thing that Stan Lee, as we mentioned before about the idea of one of his biggest aspects was interacting with the fans. And he would have a monthly column in most of the Marvel comics in the late 60s. And he would very often use these columns to talk about the importance of social justice.
Which one stands out for you?
There's a great bullpen bulletins from, I guess, around 68, where he just flat out says how intolerance is wrong, bigotry is wrong, prejudice is wrong. It's for a young audience. These are the sort of things that when Stan the man, your hero, your icon, brings you these ideas, it's much easier to stick in your mind.
I want to share this, keeping on that theme. This is Peter, who says the success of Black Panther film defines the genius of Stan Lee. He cut across cultures, and his comics found devoted readers across borders. The world will always remember fondly the genius that was Stan Lee through his timeless work. So because he brought up Stan Lee there, and you were just talking about the social justice being, a big part of his work, I wonder, though, how different that was for the time, because of course in 2018 that does not seem that groundbreaking, but can you give us a taste and remind our audience why that was so groundbreaking at the time?
Oh, certainly. Black Panther, what's fascinating is that when Black Panther was introduced, his mask originally had a cowl similar to, say, Batman, and where you could see that his skin was black. And back then, distribution for Marvel was handled basically throughout the country, these small independent distribution chains, including lots of places in the South. And so for Marvel had to actually cover up Black Panther's face to disguise whether or not he actually was black underneath that mask.
Brian, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about Stan Lee's legacy. We really appreciate your time today. Take care.
And I will end with this tweet from Midas Monkey, who says Stan was a pioneer and the catalyst of the comic industry. He was the first to conceive of fantasy universes that encompass many others in which everyone had a hero. So a reminder to our community with that, if you have a story you'd like to see on the stream, pitch us at AJ Stream. See you next time.